On behalf of Duke University, it's my great honor to welcome my friend, the Honorable Walter Davis, to this interview held under the auspices of Duke's Living History program. I am Malcolm Gillis, Professor of Public Policy and of Economics and Dean of the Graduate School. Seated on my left, the other panelist is Professor Timothy Lamperis of the Department of Political Science. Walter Davis is a native Tar Heel. These days he splits his time, more or less 50-50, between Kitty Hawk and Midland, Texas. Walter has been a leading figure in the international oil business for almost the whole time that I have been alive, perhaps a little longer. Among other things in the oil business, he was a vice president of Occidental Petroleum during the 60s and right up to the 70s. Walter has been a trustee not only of Duke University, but of our splendid sister institution down the road, the University of North Carolina and the University of North Carolina system. Walter has many interests. His abiding interest these days is education, particularly public education. We're here today, however, to talk to Walter about his perspectives on many aspects of his life and the world as it has evolved during his lifetime, particularly in the international oil business, his acquaintance and friendship with a number of people that have been very prominent in political life, both at the national level and the international level and at the state level as well. My colleague Timothy Lamperis will open the questions.
Mr. Davis, we are very privileged to have you here this afternoon with the Living History program, and we know you bring to us this afternoon a very rich life of experience in the oil business, which has brought you to Texas, familiarity with key figures in the Vietnam War, as well as people in the Middle East, both in business and in politics, and obviously as well in your years with Occidental Petroleum, with Armand Hammer, and then in the Soviet Union. What I thought I'd do to ask you first of all is to have you tell us a little bit about your entry into the oil business, the kinds of things you learned about how business is conducted in that world, and how that's helped you in your succeeding career from when you first started.
I went to work for a gentleman in California with a F.N. Rumley Company because my younger life I spent running the transportation business, and long-haul transportation business at that time was in its infancy. And the company that I went to work with was primarily hauled liquefied petroleum gas from the refineries to people that use it in the field, the retail business. I worked there for about 5 years, I suppose, and his son, who was my age and myself, did not get along. His son, in my opinion, in those days made a lot of mistakes. It cost several millions of dollars, and I saw it and knew it and advised him against it. And then when he made his mistake, I made the mistake of going to him and telling him he made a mistake, which was not very good. And until finally, Mr. Rumley said, you know, Walter, you've proven what you can do in the transportation business, but I can't let you and my son be together. You know, and of course I got to take care of my son. I know he's lost $7 or $8 million, but if he learned something, well, maybe it'll all work out all right in the end, but I don't want to hurt you. And I'll pay you, I'll put up a trust fund to pay you your salary the rest of your life. And I said, Mr. Rumley, I don't want that. You know, I can go get a job. I don't have any trouble in the transportation business, because in those days people were they were looking for people that had experience in transportation, over-the-road, long-haul transportation. So he put me in charge of a company up in in Sacramento. And he told his son not to go up there and bother me. Just let me run it. And they'd been losing about $1 million a year in that operation in Sacramento. And I went up there and started making $1 million a year. I stayed up there 2 years. When he came up and told me, you know, we just can't have you two together, that's all. I wouldn't let his son come in the yard. That's what started it all, because he always got in my business. And he said, well, you know, Walter, he said, if you want a business, I'll finance the business for you. And he said, I got an idea that maybe will work, and he had spent a lot of his lifetime in California in the oil business, in and around the oil business. And he said, I would suggest that you go out to Midland, Texas, and look at what happens out in the oil field when they find an oil well and they can't market it because they don't have any pipelines. And the only way to handle it is by truck. And the oil is not being handled properly at this time. And Mr. Rumman was well known in the oil business. He knew Jones, who was chairman of the board and one of the founders of City Service. He knew another Jones who founded Richfield and was there. Boots Adams with Phillips Petroleum in Bartlesville, and people of that stature that did a lot of business in Midland. And Midland at that time was in the middle of what we call a Sprayberry boom. They had 300 rigs drilling in one place, in one area. And it was a major discovery. And actually, you could read the paper almost in that field at night because of the flares that were going on. When they found a well where they tested, they would run it because it had a lot of gas in it to see what kind of well it had. And so I went out there, and I almost didn't go because when I went out there, it was 115 degrees. The hottest had been in 25 years. And the sand and dirt was down my neck and in my hair and everywhere. I mean, there's just no escaping getting around it. No place to live because Midland was in a boom itself. But I went out in the field and saw how they handled that crude oil, and I was just so amazed at the way they did it that I knew reasonably well that I could make some imprint on that type of business. And so I went back to, I went back to California and told him that I felt like there was certainly an opportunity to build a company, a transportation company, because the people that had the trucks that were hauling the oil, the tanks leak, the pumps leak. You go around an unloading plant at a major pipeline, and the oil was ankle deep in places. People wore boots to get there, and of course the hazard of an explosion and all was there, along with the other problems of losing a lot of oil. So he financed 6 trucks, which I picked up and drove to Midland from Pontiac, Michigan, and started the Western Oil Transportation. I had projected that, and he had told me not to be discouraged because he said every new business I've known has had a loss for at least a year, 18 months, and to get started, there'll be a lot of startup expenses and so forth. The first month we were in business, I made $15,000, which surprised me, but we were busy all the time. And there was a lot of stealing going on in the field at that time, and people generally knew that. And we had no reason to steal crude oil or kerosene or anything else for that matter. We just were in the transportation business. And the oil companies found out the kind of service that we could give with 6 trucks, and then we had more than we could do. We started building new equipment almost every week from then until I sold the company to Occidental. We went from that $15,000 a month to $1 million a month. And I think it was 75 or 78 months that every month we made more money than we'd made the month before. It was a very lucrative business, and we finally decided to take it public, and it did go on the New York Stock Exchange as Permian Corporation. Because in the process of doing this transportation, it became necessary to form a purchasing company where we actually owned the oil and picked it up at the lease and delivered it and sold it to the oil companies in the major pipelines. And we, of course, the normal things that were problems in the transportation business. Drivers were quite a problem. And the West Texas people are a little different from probably what we see back here. To give you a good example, I had the best driver I had, haul more crude oil than anybody else. One day I told him to go haul a well, which was a particularly rough road. And he said, I'm not going to do it. And 2 days later, I saw him walking in. He'd walked 2 days, left the truck in the field. And I said, why didn't you bring your truck in? That's easier than walking. He said, I don't want driving your stuff if I'm not working for you. And that's the kind of people that we found in West Texas. It was really a different breed of people than we see here in the oil field particularly. Hard-working people and a lot of honesty that went on between the people in the business we were in, which what we became involved in purchasing of crude oil. And it really struck me pretty hard, I think, having seen some things, even at that age in North Carolina, about the legal aspects of making a trade, of buying a house, or somebody buying a company, or buying stock, or buying an interest in things, or making contracts and all. And it was a real pleasant surprise that in Midland, and I don't know how many wells I've drilled. Maybe I've drilled 150. I don't know how many. It was a real pleasant surprise, though, to know that we moved 400,000 to 500,000 barrels a day of crude oil, either by purchase or by transportation. And we never had any contracts. I drilled those wells with people. I never drilled one straight up by myself. You always got your friends if you thought it was a good deal, or they got you to get involved in a deal with them. And I just didn't have any contracts. And I've never had one person to renege on their obligation. They would buy crude oil sometime and something would happen to the market. And these were all big companies, Exxon, Shell, all of them practically, Phillips, you name it. And the oil purchasing group were really kind of a fraternity among themselves, because if somebody bought some crude oil and they did something, happened to the movement of crude, which was a complicated business by itself, and he got in trouble, always somebody helped him out. I mean, I've done it many times. I've had it done for me, where I made a mistake in transferring crude oil from one refinery to another, or bringing it in by ship and so forth. I've made a lot of mistakes. But as a rule, I've never asked anybody to help me out of a problem. They didn't do it. They would lend me crude oil. I'd lend them crude oil in the pipeline, so we solved our problems. And it was a real pleasant surprise as compared to the way people do business in North Carolina, for an example.
So business was by handshakes.
That's right. It really was. And I never had nobody refuse to pay their bills, and of course I pay my bills every day. That's one thing Mr. Rumley told when I went there. He said, son, 3 things: hire the best lawyer in Texas and put him on retainer, and hire the best accountant you can find and put him on retainer, and you pay your bills every day. They come in, you sit down and write a check as long as you live, and you'll always have fine credit and all. And I practiced that too ever since I started the business. We paid our deals on time. It was a unique business too, because in the trading and exchanging of crude oil, you deal in a lot of pipelines that go different places, and you deal in lots of different grades of crude oil, because one refinery might not be able to handle what we call sour crude, which means it has a lot of sulfur in it, or another one that might be sweet crude that you almost could burn in your car without even going to the refinery. So you had to be careful to keep these crudes separated. And then you did a lot of trading, and we might trade crude oil in Texas for crude oil in California, for an example. Or you might trade crude oil for gasoline. In some parts of the country that you could sell gasoline and make a profit, we traded crude oil for gasoline. It was a complicated business, and I would guess that maybe there weren't more than 150 or 200 people in the whole United States that really understood that business. It didn't mean that intelligent people couldn't learn it. There just wasn't a need for them, because they handled all the movement of crude oil and products in the whole United States and foreign too. So the company really grew, and as a consequence of being in the middle of the oil field, well, I got involved in drilling some myself, and drilling with other people. And that's kind of the background of how I got into Midland and how we built Permian, which was later sold. I think Sockstone sold it for $400 million, and later sold for $600 million. It developed into a real major company. And I think everybody, I know that the people worked for me, every one of them became multimillionaires out of that company.
Walter, of the 135 wells that you had a part in drilling, how many of them are dry holes?
Well, I wasn't counting dry holes when I told you how many I drilled.
I should have known to ask a question about a Texas oil field. That's good. That's good. And just this is for my own interest. In those fields out in Texas, what was the deepest you ever had to go?
Well, I had an interest in a well that went down to 25,000 feet.
25,000.
And it cost, I think, $6 million.
Huh.
And but it was what we call a whispering interest. You know, it was a .00001, for example. I mean, there were a lot of people involved in that well. It was a dry hole, incidentally. But
One of those you didn't count.
that's right. I didn't count.
Walter, your background has taken you to Libya. It's taken you to Washington so many times, and dealing with so many political figures and civil servants. Let me ask you a question about the evolution of U.S. energy policy in the 70s, and particularly your part in trying to help build up an oil stockpile.
Well, I knew that the Arabs were keeping track of the world production. Of course, the Saudis are who I knew better than any of them and more reliable to deal with, because I think Yamani was an absolute top honest man with his business in the rest of the world. And in fact, he became one of the 10 most powerful men in the world.
Sheikh Yamani.
Yeah, he was a great guy. We visited him about 3 years ago in Saudi Arabia, my wife and myself, and it was really interesting to go up there and see, you know, how he lived and how he entertained his friends and so forth. I visited him on business, but I went up there and enjoyed the visit. And I'd been to Saudi Arabia before and knew him before, because Oxidone built a fertilizer plant, urea plant in Saudi Arabia. But I began to see, and listening to people, that we had a finite amount of energy in this country. In other words, to give you a relative answer to that question, the average well in Saudi Arabia will produce 20,000 barrels a day. The average well in the United States will produce 20 barrels a day. So we don't have the big fields that they have. There's been some big fields, probably the Yates field, which is one of those wells will produce more than any wells in the world, but it's a very small reef wells. They're 800 feet, they'll produce 100,000 barrels a day if you get it through the pipe. That's the only one that anybody's ever heard of. And theirs, of course, their production is really in sand, where it flows very freely to the wellbore and got a lot of pressure gas in behind it. But I began to see, and we had import quotas in that you sold too. The independents got a quota for their crude oil, and the government gave them an import quota ticket, which they turned around and sold to the major companies. It was really a gimmick to help them to stay in business, because crude oil prices in Saudi Arabia and all Middle East crude, for that matter, was in the $2, $3 range at that time, or less if you bought big quantities. So I got to thinking about and talking to people who work for Aramco and all about these things that I knew absolutely nothing about. But it certainly seemed to me like that we just had a real problem with energy in this country. So I had talked to some of the Saudis about a big purchase of crude oil, that we really could take the crude itself and let the independents sell their crude in the world market, and their own crude would be turned over to the federal government, because there's no need of pumping it out of the ground and taking it and putting it in a salt dome, which the government did, and then pumping it back out again. Number one is you might not get it all out. And, you know, if you develop a crack in one of those salt domes, you lose the whole thing, which has happened at times. So I started thinking about it, and I got this the law firm that I put on retainer when I went there was a man named Ed Clark, who really ran Texas for about 25 years, and he was the gentleman who carried the court case for Lyndon Johnson down in Duval County when he won by 158.
Oh, the landslide Lyndon.
158. And that's another story that would take me a long time to tell. Was really interesting how all that ended up and why the trend, the story it took. But anyway, he became, of course, as you know, very powerful in American politics. And I went to see him and with Ed Clark, and told him, you know, what I was saying. This is when he was a senator. about our energy supply, which was going to run out. You know, at that time, I think they said something like 40 years. I think our production at that time was in the magnitude of 15, 18 million barrels a day in the United States. We could take care of all of it without any problem. And to relate to that, today we're importing 51% of our energy that we use in this country from some foreign country. But at any rate, it looked like it had some merit to it, and he felt like it did. And so he sent me over to see the Secretary of Interior at that time was named Udall. And I went over to see him about it, and I don't know, I never really got anywhere with him. I mean, he believed I was right about it, but he said the politics were so bad that nobody would get it done. So I thought, well, you know, I got time to do it. So I went to see Dean Rusk and talked to him about it. He agreed with it. And I went to the State Department, had a guy in charge of the Middle East at that time. I think his name was Cisco.
Joseph Cisco.
At that time. And talked to him about it. Everybody agreed it was right. I talked to Johnson about it again and so forth. Everybody agreed it was the right thing to do, but nobody would really take the steps necessary to get it done. Then you're just fighting a windmill. I mean, you might as well go home and spend your time trying to do something you could get done. So nothing ever really came of that. But we could have bought at that time, we could have bought 1 billion barrels of crude oil for $1.60 a barrel. And not only filled up the salt dome, but had reserves in the ground in various parts of the United States strategically located, like the naval reserves up in the northern part of our country, and reserves in California, and somewhere besides the East Coast, which of course obviously used up most of our energy. And that idea stayed with me for a long time, and really I felt like that the time would come when we would do that but it takes some national emergency probably to let it happen, which eventually did happen, of course, and we got the salt dome down in Texas, and they filled up the first, and then they didn't know how to get it out. So they hired some engineers and private industry guys and show them how to get it out. But we do have about a 90-day supply to use conservatively of crude to either put on the market to keep prices in order or to use in case of an emergency it got done. And you know, I felt like it was a great movement in the part of the United States. So to go back some, in '73, I think is when the oil shortage really hit us,
October.
When the Middle East put their embargo on crude oil. And the president formed a energy council. I think there were about 25 members of that, and I was one of them. The president appointed me to that portion of it. There was a number of ones formed at that time about energy, but that was one supposed to talk about energy policy and what we were doing. And at that time, and these numbers might not be exact, but the multitude of it is so great that they can't be too far off, I don't think, when I say they spent billions of dollars in private industry and the government in trying to develop another source of energy. And as a matter of fact, the experts will tell you that we have enough coal to last for 300 years in the United States. And it's kind of foolish to be using up our gas, which again has a finite, someday zero number, that we don't use that coal while we can. But anyway, that's what they were trying to do, is degasify coal into fuel oil and crude oil, as the Germans had already done, and in recent years have done in South Africa. And then the other thing was the oil shale. And the oil shale was another thing that was where maybe there was 200 years worth of oil at present consumption, and future be it rising 2 to 5% a year to last. And there were billions of dollars put into these two efforts, both by government and private industry. So I went to the first meeting, and Jim Parker, who was chairman of the board and one of the principal stockholders in Parker Drilling Company, I went to him, I said, Jim, you know, I don't mind being on a board, but I'm not coming up here because there's some rules say you got to have a public hearing. If anybody's already made up their mind about what they're going to do, there's no need me wasting your time, my time doing it. He said, I don't think that that's true. But in the council that he appointed, you had so many cross problems with people in that it didn't look to me like you could come to a right conclusion. You had the cool oil producers, you had the refiners, you had the gas producers, you had the gas refiners, you had the gas pipelines, you had, you know, all sorts of things that didn't mesh together unless they were done on an economic scale and probably controlled by the government in the sense of how they mashed them together. And I said, well, you know, I'd love to be here, but I'll see what happens. And I went to the first meeting, and really, you could see this coming out right away. The conflict that was established in that committee when it was appointed was really bad. It was so bad that I didn't think they were going to do anything. And then I went to the second meeting. And then somebody told me that I think knew what they were talking about in the White House. They'd already made up their mind what they were going to do. They were going to drop it all. And I went to see Jim Parton. I said, Jim, I got enough. I'm not going up here anymore. And I didn't go anymore.
Did Mr. Schlesinger have a role in all
well,
this?
Mr. Schlesinger, to me, is you know, that I'm sorry to talk about accommodations. I know you two gentlemen
I could say a lot about it,
with
too.
whole land, but he is the biggest liar I've ever met. You know, he don't mind smiling and laughing, and I think he's absolutely stupid in so many ways. It's practical that I can't begin to tell you. And I have said this to him, so I'm not talking about it back.
I knew him before he was in politics or in government.
No.
And he was already a fool.
This was an economist in
Yes.
Virginia, right?
Yes.
And then they put him, you know, well, you can't believe they put him in charge of defense, you know. But anyway, I quit going. And during the '73 deal, when they formed the Energy Department, you know, I came to a firm conclusion. I always believed this, but I really hadn't in my mind gelled the fact that it was a true fact. And that was it's against the law in our government to hire somebody that knows what they're doing. They took people, I mean, they put the farmer in charge of the oil men, and the oil men in charge of the doctors, and doctors in charge of the fishermen, and, you know, it just goes on and on. There was nobody in that whole department, not in the whole department, that knew what they were doing. I mean, and really, we didn't have any gas shortage then, if it had been handled right inside of our government. But for an example, Wolf Point, Montana is a crossroads. Maybe there's 300 people up there, I don't know. But they allotted Wolf Point, Montana, which didn't have a pipeline or anything, 500 million gallons of gasoline. You know, that was, and you couldn't even get it up there. And then you try to pry that allocation, which was set aside, not being used at all because it couldn't go to Wolf Point. There wasn't any way to get it there. They kept that in there 2 years before finally they decided they couldn't get it up there and started breaking loose to let the public have it. It just absolutely made no sense at all. They did not have one person in there. And I don't know that they do now, because I think the last guy was in there was a dentist in the Department of Energy. I don't know. I think the guy there now probably has got some savvy.
Watkins is the Navy admiral.
Yeah. And I think he's got some savvy about nuclear energy, which is another whole story about our energy program. But at least I think he had a lot more than what went in there before. And I don't think a dentist really knows what he's doing when he's talking about, you know, moving all around and all.
He knows about drilling.
Yeah, he can drill all right. That's right. He don't get rented dry holes either. But that was a fiasco of our country got involved in, and actually that's still true. Because what has happened is all those billions of dollars that they spent in researching and really building or coming close to building a coal degasification process and oil shale and coal. And a lot of studies have been made about how it would fit into our plants, or especially electrical generating plants. It was really, they did a good job of analyzing it. When it got down to the working people, they found some people that knew what they were doing. And those things were available and still available to our country. Yet when Reagan took controls off of crude oil, they didn't even put those plants into mothballs. They just stopped right there, just shut them down. And I think that was a real crime in our country, because we still got the energy problem. We will have it until our country, somebody gets nerve enough or sense enough or whatever it takes, the public or whatever, to use our gas and oil resources that we have in coal and in oil shale, and to put it in the proper places where it can be used and conserve the fuel that you can move and transport by. And they just dropped the whole ball. Now, this last deal in the Persian Gulf may, I hope, have gotten some of Congress decide to maybe go ahead and open up those other research propositions, because we are importing now more than we're producing in our own country.
Walter, it's now been 25 years since King Idris was overthrown in Libya and Muammar Gaddafi took over right shortly after the overthrow. You knew King Idris and you knew Libya in the days before Gaddafi. Could you tell us a little bit about your impressions of the Kingdom of Libya while King Idris was still in control?
Well, let me make clear, I'm not any expert on that. I went over there a few times when he was in control and saw some of his ministers, but I'm not any expert on, certainly on the Middle East. I just had a little bit of experience, not an expert. But, you know, he was a religious leader. That's really why he was running and of course his heritage was that throne there. And I think probably he was a pretty good man himself, from all I could gather, and tried to take care of the welfare of his people, but he had some ministers over there that were absolutely dishonest. I don't think those people go to bed and sleep nights unless they can steal something that day. They're just unhappy about the days going, because they really were dishonest people to deal with. You couldn't depend on what they said at all. But he was a benevolent dictator, in my opinion. And then, of course, Gaddafi took over. I think he took a vacation to Greece or Italy, one of the two. I forgot which country now. And while he was gone, well, they had the revolution, and Gaddafi ended up as dictator there. And during that time, Occidental got their leases in Libya and paid some of the guys there that were in Idris's cabinet to get them. And they turned out to be real prolific oil fields, of course, one of the things that helped make Occidental. He was, and a story I get amused at was in order to get the oil out of the country, and this time it was good sweet crude oil. It was really fine crude oil there. I believe my numbers are correct in that Occidental spent about $2.5 or $3 million, no, about $8 million, I think, to rent, and to pay another $2 million or $2.5 million to import food from Italy, to rent a tent. And they rented the finest chinaware and everything for the king and his entourage, which was considerable. And the kings, they had solid gold plates and gold knives and forks and all the rest of it to put on a big show for him. And I don't know how many people came there, but they were in the, you know, like the $20,000 to $30,000, I mean, 20 to 30,000 people in that range anyway. And after the celebration was all over, and I forgot how many sheep they killed, something like 10,000 sheep. You know, maybe it was 30,000, I don't know, but it was a tremendous number of sheep. I thought we were going to de-sheep Libya, you know. There's so many of them. And, but anyway, he came and they had a great dinner for him. The celebration's over. And those people, him being king and being a kind of a religious leader too, they stole everything, including the tent poles and rope. They didn't miss a thing. And I think our total bill ended up in that whole deal at something like $25 million for that party that they gave King Idris.
You had to make good the loss of that stealing.
Yeah.
Is that?
Everything there. But you know, $25 million, that's not much money when you start talking about crude oil in Libya. And it's not much money anywhere when you start talking about crude oil of that magnitude that those wells would produce there. And they basically got the same sand formation they got in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
You knew the Hunts fairly well, I guess.
Well, I wasn't real friendly with them because I didn't like them.
Right.
But I did have opportunities from time to time to sit down and talk about negotiations and some crude deals and so forth.
Jim Stone, who was head of the Commodities Futures Trading Commission at the time that the Hunt brothers were allegedly trying to corner the world's silver market, Jim Stone maintains that it was actions taken by the Commodities Futures Trading Commission that led to the downfall of the so-called Hunt scheme to corner the world's silver market. Do you think that was all there was to it?
Well, he might, I don't know. I don't know much about the commodity market to answer that question, but I don't think he knew what he was talking about. I mean, that's my own personal opinion. Because Hammer had this I don't know what you'd call it. And he would talk to you in private, but if somebody came out, he'd quit talking. And everybody used to say, well, he don't want it, this on tape or anything. And he's the greatest it takes, because in New York City, when he got ready to try to make a deal or something, he'd get a limousine they rented from one of the rental limousine companies up there, but it was his. That's what nobody knew that it belonged to him. That had the finest recording equipment in it that money could buy, that whole limousine. And he'd tell these guys, he'd say, we ought to get out of this office, might be bugged, and we'd better go somewhere. Let's ride over in New Jersey, and back, and we can talk about it over there where nobody can hear us, And he'd record everything went on there. If you could ever get his tapes, you'd open up a worldwide of, I don't know what would happen. It's really, but he told me himself now that he was going to short silver when it was about $25 an ounce, as I recall. And I said, well, doctor, I don't know anything about the commodity market, but they tell me that's the most treacherous market there is in the world. And certainly from a little bit that I know about it, I got to believe that it's not a very safe thing to be fooling around with that, because it's possible to really have some huge losses or huge gains. It's really a gambling market. He said, won't be a gambling market for me. I said, if I shorted, I said, well, tell me about that. And he said, well, the Russians have agreed to put up the silver necessary for me to short the market. And in my opinion, that's what got the Hunts when he started shorting it and started pouring that silver in when the call came. Well, I think that's what did the job.
Yeah, because I never did believe the story about the Commodities Futures Trading Commission doing them under, because I thought the Hunts were a lot smarter than that.
Well, I would think so too. I mean, they should have been pros in it, really. But it looked like at that time, if my memory serves me right, that they had done pretty well until everything broke on the soybean deal, when they tried to corner the soybean market, which is, they ended up having to really pay through the nose for that transaction. And for the silver one too, because they had to take personal bankruptcy over that one. If my memory serves me right, it was one of the South American countries that brought suit against them that got a judgment for $160 million, and that would be just the only one unless he'd taken bankruptcy. I've
never asked you this before. Did you know John Connolly very well?
I did. He was a nice man. He used to come down to Hatteras fishing with me. I always had great admiration for him.
He's back in business now, I guess.
Well, he is. He's trying to make a living, I reckon. Yeah. But I've never seen him do anything that even had any twinge of dishonesty.
Well, I never believed that story about the $10,000 on the milk bill, because if he was going to give himself up, John Connolly certainly wouldn't do it for any $10,000.
Oh, that's ridiculous.
Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember the story, but he could have called in $15, $20 million if he really wanted to call it in. I mean, by good friends, because people liked him. He was a likable man.
Do you believe if that mess hadn't have broken, that John Connolly might have been a presidential candidate? Seriously?
No.
No?
I don't think so.
How come?
I really, it's hard for me to answer that question because he's really a nice man. And everybody that I knew that I introduced him to immediately, you know, began to like him. He was that kind of a fellow to know. And I've never heard anybody say anything to him about being dishonest. So he handled, and those are qualifications a guy needs to have be president of the United States. But I think it was because he had the ability to take over things. I mean, he would go into things, and he didn't do it in an obnoxious kind of way. He did it in a very friendly way.
Like Treasury Department.
Yeah, I mean, he just had the ability to gather strength from people and go ahead and run it. And I think he did a lot of that, needing to do it in kind of a hurry to be president. I think he did a lot of that probably didn't do him any good to run. I've never heard that expressed by anybody, but I personally feel that way because he would have made a great president. And I think it hurt him a whole lot to change parties too. Mm-hmm. I believe he would have been president probably if he hadn't changed parties. That's my belief anyway.
Walter, just to get, we've been ranging from Libya to Texas to Sacramento. Could we come back to North Carolina a minute? Walter, you've developed an extremely strong interest in public education in the last 10 to 20 years. And I just wondered if you have any perspectives on public education that you'd like to share with us, perspectives that stem from your role as a trustee of a private university and as a member of the Board of Governors of a major public university system, UNC, and the evolution of higher education in general, and public lower education as well.
Well, I have to kind of tell things in relationship to give you an answer to that, so I hope I'm not wasting your time. But when I was a kid, I was mischievous. I didn't ever burn up the schoolhouse, but I might have tore up the window or something sometime, you know. And I got kicked out of high school down at Weeksville, North Carolina. And of course, you know, in those days you get a whipping at school, you get one when you get home, which I did. So my father decided to let me go to Elizabeth City to school. And I went up there, and the principal, a guy named Bundy, I went down to his office. And when I walked in his office, he shook me. He just grabbed me and shook me. And I said, Mr. Bundy, don't do that anymore. He said, well, I understand that you're a troublemaker. And I said, well, I don't think I'm one. And then he shook me again, and I laid him out on the floor. And I took my books and went home. And my family, which couldn't afford it, a very poor farming family, well, they sent me to Hargrave Military Academy for a couple of years, and I got the same problem up there first night. But it did do me a lot of good. I mean, what education I really got, I think I got there because we had, in those days, had teachers that really cared about what a student did and worked with them, and they certainly, I got a lot of that while I was there. And in my father's time, and I began to realize this, I think, fairly young, my father never went to school. I mean, he learned how to read and write because my mother was a school teacher, and that's how he learned to read and write and figure and all. And it wasn't really necessary to go to school either in those days when you come up. I mean, you had to learn how to read and write some, but not to go ahead and maybe have a timber company or something like that. It wasn't really that necessary. And then when I came along, you could have a high school education and get along pretty good. I mean, that's the first thing I actually got, a high school education. And now, I mean, I begin to see all this grow. Now you better have a college education if you're going in a profession. You might be an entrepreneur and still make a lot of money in this country. But basically, you do need that kind of education. And I know, too, how many times I have been in the meetings. I've been in the meetings with lawyers and accountants, which I had to do an awful lot when I was running the company. And I knew the deficits I had in my own background, my own education, that had I had the knowledge of an accountant or an attorney or an engineer or whatnot, I probably could have done a lot better than I did. I mean, I had lots of help. The one thing about my background that I'd like for you to know is that older people have guided nearly every part of my life. Somebody I had confidence in, and really liked, that had took the time to sit down and talk to me about doing things and how to do them and what to guard against and all. And that's a true statement. And I listened to them. I mean, I listened to people who I felt like knew more than I did, and I always try to hire somebody who knew 10 times as much as I did. And was good at that, I think. Had a great bunch of people working for me. And so I missed the education that I wished I had in order to cope with some of the things in politics and finance and so forth that I had knowledge of myself without having to hire people to do it for me. And that was a real deep running concern in my life. It really was. But I suppose the reason that I got involved as much as I did was my wife was a school teacher. She went to teach school at Massey Hill in Fayetteville, and she got $99 a month. And I figured out she made enough money for us to live on. I didn't have to work anymore. You know, I thought she's a wealthy woman because I'm driving a truck for McLean Truck Company, making $45 a week. You know, and so, but she was a very compassionate person about kids, because Massey Hill in those days was really kind of cross the tracks type thing with the cotton mills and everything, and she just had a lot of compassion for the children and their education. And then when we moved to California, she went teaching there and later became a principal and then assistant superintendent. And she really did have a great feeling for the Mexicans out there. The blacks were not the problem as far as minorities and not getting an education. It was Mexicans. And she took a lot of time, personal time after work, to help those students. And then I met a guy who had a drilling company in Midland, who became a great fellow to me, like I'm talking about older people that have helped me along, you know. And he wanted me to go out to Santa Anita with him one weekend. And of course, I don't like the horse races anyway. But I certainly went because he asked me to go. And he had a lot of business, too, that he could give me if he wanted to. And I was working on a deal with him at the time. And I went out there, and he was they threw away the whole pattern, the whole thing when they made him, because he was really a generous man and a very fortunate man. Never went to school at all, didn't have any education. But they found oil all over about 5 sections that he had out in the middle of the desert that I think his father had bought for like 30 cents an acre. And he had a service station, built a highway through there, and he became very wealthy, worth several $100 million. And I went out there with him, and he was, you know, he was really very gracious with me. I mean, to explain things to me and tell me about things and all. And then we went out to the track and stayed, and I came back with him. And on the way back, he said, "Now, Walter, I want to tell you something." He said, "You probably are going to be a real success." And I was, you know, I was getting along where maybe I was worth $1 million at that time. I don't know what it would have been, something in that range anyway. And he said, "But I think you're going to be a real success. But one thing I want you to think about that has done me a great stead in my life, and that is that you need to invest a lot of your money, if you make a lot, into people and not into business, but people. That's the key to just about everything, and certainly education is one of them. So if you make any money, you remember this, because there's so many people that have the desire, they got the background and the innate common sense to be smart, that don't get an opportunity. And that started me doing things, trying to help people to go to the university. I mean, to get them in school. And my wife was, of course, and she was living then, so she knew the principals of a lot of schools, and that's where we drew from to get these kids to go to school, was to find them and you know, work for them to get a good college degree, and it's been very successful. I don't think we've ever had, and all of them, I don't think we've ever had over maybe 4 or 5 don't like to use the word failures. They turned out okay. They didn't turn into the dope world and all the other problems that young people face nowadays. But out of all of them, well, they were probably only 4 or 5 real failures. They just got in trouble and so forth. Out of all of them, and you know, I feel like the desire, because of what my mother did and what my wife did, and what I heard from him, was very. You know, it had a lot to do with me being interested in education. And I got to know a lot of people in education through that were in the universities and in the preparatory schools and so forth. So I've spent a fair amount of what I had in doing that and giving scholarships and so forth to kids. It's worked out pretty good.
Walter, you knew Dean Rusk pretty well.
Yeah, I wasn't a close personal friend of his at all, but I knew him well enough to get to see him if I needed to. And he was always I thought he was a great man myself.
He was reputed to be not only a very intelligent person, and I guess he was that.
I'm sure.
But also a man of rather balanced judgment. You first met him in the Kennedy years?
I suppose it was. I'd have to think back on that, but I think it was then. Yeah, I believe that's right, because he was Secretary of State then. I suppose that's right.
If there's time in the second hour, we sure hope that you will be able to share with us your views on Landslide Lyndon's victory.
Well, it's so legally complicated that it's almost impossible for me to do it, but I'll tell you what I'll do. And this is something that's really interesting, and it may be documented somewhere. I'll find out from my lawyer, but he knows the whole story, and he'll write it down for you, because it was a real intrigue into the workings of our legal system is what made him win that.
The Senate race of '48.
Yeah, and if if they had moved the right moves legally, the Supreme Court would have thrown him out. But they moved it all just absolutely perfect to where he was accepted by the Senate, and they couldn't throw him out. They had to do it before he was put in. So it's a long story, but it sure is interesting. That county down there, you know, it's Duval County is like a fiefdom down there. You know, the people vote like you write the votes. And, you know, whatever you want done, you get done.
Well, I know Tim's going to ask you some questions about your interaction with Mr. Johnson on the Vietnam War in the second hour. You've known lots of political figures in North Carolina going back in the early 50s, right on up to the present. Was there any of those that you felt like made the biggest positive difference in North Carolina, starting from way back before Luther Hodges and going on up to the present? The ones that were outstanding and unusual in what they were able to accomplish for the people of North Carolina?
I never did really know. Terry Sanford I knew in his days, of course, and still do. But Luther Hodges, in my opinion, was the one governor in North Carolina that's done more for North Carolina than any citizen in modern times, because I don't know enough about history to know what happened back, you know, during the Civil War.
We understand your views, not, you know, we particularly want your views.
But I think he was a great man. I became very friendly with him. We went fishing down in Panama and up in Canada, and we took a lot of trips together and so forth, and he was really a great man. And when he first dreamt about the Research Triangle, he began to tell me about what he was dreaming about how he got the land and everything. And every time I think I see Research Triangle, I wish he could come spend the day, you know. He had no idea it would be what it is, but he had an idea and he knew about computers. I mean, he talked about those things, what they were going to do and all that. And he just was a great guy. He did just many fine things for North Carolina, but that is the one thing that kept North Carolina from being in really bad financial shape and not able to have the capacity to move forward if our present politicians don't screw it up.
There's still people today in 1991 who would have a hard time visualizing how the presence of these three research universities could be made to have a difference. And back in the late 50s and early 60s, here was Luther Hodges already understanding it and trying to put together something, a vehicle to make it happen.
Right.
This is what's so amazing 30 years ago. And yet today, even among our academic colleagues, there are people who don't understand what the presence of these three research universities mean and what it can mean for the future.
No question about it. But, you know, he saw, he said, and of course Wake Forest hadn't moved in, you know. And he said, you know, it's, there are a lot there, and he used a thumb to tell me this story. He said, you know, that they have an expert in nearly everything in the world, including the fingernail on your thumb. And he said, a company don't want to hire somebody that knows about that thumb. But they're forced to hire them in a lot of times because there's none available to them to come and use them for 6 months or a year to give them an answer to a particular problem, whether it's a thumb or some a chemical analysis or something. And if we can build a place where they can go to that will have these experts in their midst, the companies will flock down here in time, because that's what they're looking for, is knowledge to do new things. And of course, if they come and they find new things, they will build other plants in North Carolina to manufacture those new things. And I think that was the first time he really began to kind of put it all together to help the state to get these people available to these universities.
Mr. Davis, you'd been commenting about the importance of education to our state, and you'd mentioned the foresight of Luther Hodges and in establishing the research triangle. And we know that this area in particular, and in North Carolina, that education is a very important part of our future, and our country feels that we're in something of an educational crisis as a nation. I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about what you think the challenges are and what you think the problems are for our society and for us here in North Carolina in terms of the things we need to do to improve that part of our country.
You know, one thing that I don't think that some of our leading citizens, not to detract from their knowledge and ability and all, have not recognized, and our politicians haven't recognized, that we're on the verge of a world economy. It comes home to me every morning at 6:30 or 7 o'clock when I see what the stock market is doing in Japan and Singapore and Germany and England and so forth, that we are faced with the economic community of Europe coming together and having a great workforce. I mean, they're historically have been hardworking people and innovative people in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so forth, that those in East Germany, that are hardworking people and knowledgeable people and have a good educational system. I have had one in the past. And we're going to be involved in competition with them. And they have a better education system than we have here, in my opinion, to educate people. The other thing, probably they don't have the ethnic problems in those countries that we have here, because we have different groups that are against other groups. The Mexicans don't like the Poles, and the Poles don't like the blacks, and the blacks don't like the Jewish people, and you know, and it becomes a real melting pot of problems that come about when you're trying to do something for masses of people. And we have in North Carolina, we have a problem of education of people that are going to need to be in the workforce, because if they don't get in the workforce, well, they give the whole community social problems, like prisons, for an example, and like orphanages, and like mental institutions and so forth. And when I look at and talk to people in Europe and Scandinavia, I think that probably we will not change what our problem is in North Carolina until we change our system of education. I don't think doubling the teacher's school salary is going to do it. I don't think that putting twice as much money in public education we're putting in is going to do it. The only thing that, in my opinion, will do it is that you educate the people that you have in these institutions up to the level of their intelligence. And let's face it, we all don't have the same intelligence. I mean, I run into people every day I think are 10 times smarter than I am, and I try to listen to them. But there are people whose background and the fact of their economic situation in their homes doesn't lead them to have the desire to have the kind of education they're going to need in the world that we come into when we start competing with Japan and Germany and the rest of the world. And the only thing that will do that is vocational schools, because when we look at, like I mentioned earlier about my father, no education, and then I got high school education, and then you go on from there about what can happen to people in this country. They got somewhat of the minority groups in this state have somewhat the same problem of going through these evolutions, for the simple reason that they, in their home life, has not changed a lot in the last 30 years. We like for it to change, we want it to change, but as far as education is concerned, they're not placed in a position to learn what would do them best in our society, and that is to maybe the next step they need is to be good vocational educated. We have a great need in our country for plumbers and electricians and mechanics and even waiters in our restaurants. For an example, the waiters in Europe, you always find men just about that make a living, and it's an honorable profession to be a waiter over there. And we don't educate good cooks, for an example, or good housekeepers to take care of the hotels and so forth. So we got to change it to where the minority groups will have an opportunity to do what they're capable of doing, and don't try to teach them algebra or ancient history or things that are not going to help them to take their place in society and give them an uplift in their economic conditions.
Well, this raises, I think, a very interesting question, because I think businesses are coming to appreciate this. Do you think that this kind of more practical education should be done by the educational system and the public schools, or do you think companies should assume this in what people call workplace education? I mean, I guess people are I think there's a lot of people who are seeing this, but the question is, who does this? And people seem to be kicking this responsibility back and forth.
I don't think anybody can do it but the politicians. I don't see how it can get done. I mean, sure, you got companies like Exxon or like American Airlines and whatnot. You see a lot of this where the companies are really interested in trying to help people to learn. But that's a project to take on. It's just, I don't think it's come yet in our country. We got to get the politicians to realize that they keep getting money to put in public education, and it's not working. North Carolina has the lowest SAT scores of any state in the union. And that's not by accident. That happened. I mean, we looked at it happen to us.
Do you think this should be done in secondary schools then, in
All
high
the way.
schools, or in junior colleges?
We should do it in the junior colleges. We should do it in high schools. Community college is a good thing. I think about Norway, which when you get 12 years old and out of so-called grade school, they take tests that determine what they do. They take and then their courses in high school will be either vocational, technical, or liberal arts. Those and they have a chance to get out of the track. I mean, people talk about track system like England has is not any good, and I agree with that. People should have an opportunity to make the best living they can. But in their system over there, they have an opportunity to get out of that track, and in fact have special schools to help them get out of it if they want to switch from vocational to technical, for an example. But they got to pass that test to get in at that age. Those that don't and go to vocational schools, well, they teach them a half a day. They teach them how to live. I mean, they teach them about marriage, about divorce, about sex, about how you figure interest on a bank loan, how to make out a budget, how to take care of your health, and about alcohol and drugs. And all the many facets of life they're going to run out into when they get out of high school. We don't address those problems in this state. And when they do that a half a day, then the other half a day they go to some workplace where they begin to learn a trade. I mean, a guy in a mechanic, for example, all he does to begin with is maybe help sweep the floor and wash the tools and put the tools away and learn what they are. And then he begins to learn how to use them. And when he gets out of there, he can either go to work, or he can, in a trade, or he can go to a university if he's capable of going. And they're using the maximum intelligence of that person and his direction that he wants to go in. And we come in and we graduate students by the thousands from high school that can't read and write.
Well, in terms of getting ready for this world economy and being able to cope with it, do you think maybe that we are over-investing in higher education then, and that we should transfer our resources more to these more practical forms? And I know you have been a patron of higher education for quite a period in your career. As you look back on it, do you think maybe you should have given your money more to junior colleges than to higher educations like what I represent?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so for this reason, and that is that I think that's a job for the political system to take care of. And then, you want to, certainly not your university system, like they're talking about cutting a budget now. And they say, well, we have to do it all across the board. They're being very short-sighted in that. Because let's take Chapel Hill and Duke, not Duke, but Chapel Hill and State. Those two universities have a national reputation, especially Chapel Hill. State had one at one time, and then it went downhill, and now it's beginning to come back to have a national reputation again. But when you look at those two universities, in the case of Chapel Hill, for every dollar the state puts in them, they get $1.50 back on operating expenses. So they really make money for the state because they get in more than the state gives them back. And that's to say nothing of the services that they give to the people in the state of North Carolina, such as the Institute of Government, the hospitals, and so forth. And in the matter of buildings, well, for every dollar that the state puts in, they get $2 back from other sources other than the state. So, why cut them off of that when they're actually manufacturing? It's just like a big business. If you got 10 hot dog stands, the 5 most valuable ones, you don't go close them down. You close the least effective ones, but you help the ones that are making your money. And that's a case of trying to make all 16 of our universities in North Carolina just like 16 Coke bottles, and they're different. Every one of them is different, have different needs, and should have different aims. And I think the legislature does that. I think they're very short-sighted.
Well, you certainly laid out a challenge for the legislatures. I was wondering if we could turn to some political figures now. You said this is a responsibility of the political system. Earlier you mentioned that the politics seem to make a quality that you don't know how to do your job as a way of getting a political office. Lyndon Johnson came to the Washington along with many people in the immediate post-war era. He came with an election in 1948 that had some interesting results. Do you, as a person from Texas and from that area, do you have any local information on that particular election and his entry into power?
Well, of course, the legal technicalities were involved in him overcoming that 158 votes down in Duval County. Is a very complicated thing, and I'm not capable of explaining to you myself why it happened. I mean, how it happened, all the way it took place. As I told you, I'd be happy to get that and show it to you sometime, because it's a very interesting thing that I don't think it's really been publicized very well. But he was, well, I think in many ways he was a good president. But well, there's a man that couldn't stand the pressures of a war, for an example, and to the point of not even running again. Yeah. And so, you got to have some. I have some reservations about a person of his stature, that couldn't carry out his responsibilities, I don't think, as well as he should have.
Couldn't tough it out.
That's right.
What you mentioned when you started out in the oil business, it was surprising to you that when you concluded business deals, you never signed a legal contract, and matters were taken care of by handshake. You could trust the people you did business with. One of the things that we found in the Vietnam War in the world of politics is that if trust had existed before, a lot of it broke down between people across different sides of the aisle, between the people and the government. In a living history that we had, an interview that we had with Senator Fulbright earlier, somebody who you also know, he had talked about the personal relationship that he felt he had with Lyndon prior to the Vietnam War, and the sense that they were both Southerners that had come to power in the country in 1964. Fulbright mentioned the trust that he felt when Lyndon told him things, and they didn't turn out to be true. Especially for him, the Gulf of Tonkin was a sort of an axis moment in his life, and he didn't trust Lyndon anymore after that, and he was never invited back to the White House again. Did you see any of that similar pattern of a breakdown of trust in the world of Washington that you knew?
Well, the Vietnam War, to me, I had the same feelings at that time, the beginning of it. I didn't know Senator Fulbright. In fact, that war is what brought me to know him, because I just thought it was one of the worst things this country had ever done. And I used to ask some people in the Senate, in the House, and local politicians, what would happen if all the Vietnamese people died? One morning we woke up and they're all dead. What would we do? We'd come home. Well, why stay there and kill them? You know, it didn't make any sense to me, because if we were after trade, and most wars have a basis somewhere in it of trade, and that one, to me, didn't have any basis at all. We didn't want to conquer any territory, and it just was no reason to be there. We weren't trying to accomplish anything, and in addition to that, the politicians tried to run that war instead of letting the Army run it as they did in this last Persian Gulf deal. I think that's one of the great things that Bush did. He turned it over to somebody and said, there it is, you run it. You know, you answer to me and you run it. And it's turned out great. But the politicians didn't do that. In fact, I'm told by people that knew Johnson that when they, I forgot the name of the ship now that was shot at and sailors captured off of
Mayaguez.
Yeah, Mayaguez.
Right.
That I'm told that they went in and told Johnson, he says, we're going to attack North Korea immediately.
Oh, this is the Pueblo incident.
Pueblo, that's
incident.
it, right.
Right.
We want to attack them immediately. You know, we call all the staff together in the morning and we just get cranked up and we go get those people. And his probably his ideals were all right, his ideas were right, but the only trouble was we didn't have the power to go do it, and that's all. And he really got done in dumps over that, so I'm told too. And he just literally in tears about when they said, well, we just can't, we don't have the power to do it. And of course, as you know better than I do, I'm sure many military leaders and politicians both have always said, don't ever get into a land war with China because you're wasting your time. And I believe that too. So I was against that when I met and got to know Fulbright, because we had somewhat the same ideas. His was better than mine, of course, but mine was kind of on a basis of logical things about why are we there. I never saw the need for the communism and the domino theory and all that. To me, never really existed there. I mean, that's the way I felt about it anyway. Okay,
now you've, from moving from the transportation business from California to the oil business in Texas, you got involved with Occidental Petroleum and went over to take part in the world economy in Libya and Saudi Arabia. How did you conduct business with the Libyans and the Saudis? In Texas, you shook hands. Did you have some awkward experiences where you came to have to deal in different ways? But how differently did you feel you had to conduct business in Libya as opposed to Texas?
unfortunately, the only way to do business at that time with the Libyans and most of the people in the Arab world at that time where the oil was, and in fact many of our neighbors in South America, you pay somebody off. That's that simple. I think one of the worst things we did in our country was to penalize businessmen for paying off foreign powers.
As we do have rules against that.
I mean, you go to jail for it. But the fact of the matter is, that's the only way they'll do business. So what are you going to do? I had a Libyan tell me one time after this big discussion came up, he said, whatever he called me, it wasn't by my first name, but he had a kind of a pet word he called me. He said, you know, I do not like to do business with you. I said, why not? I mean, what have I done that offended you? He said, nothing. I said, well, tell me why. He said, well, when the Japanese and Germans come here, I know they'll pay me off. When you come here, I don't know where I'm going to get paid off or not. So why should I fool with you when I can get what I want out of either the Japanese or Germans? And we don't like that system of government in our country, and I'm glad it does not prevalent like it is in Mexico and other places. But that's a fact of life. In many of those countries, you either pay somebody off or you don't give business. And I think it's been a detriment in the United States because when you're in country, you do what they do. I mean, you abide by their rules. They don't care about your morality in the United States at all. They just pay somebody.
What about one of the things that we notice about the Middle East is its tremendous political instability. Politics keep changing. There's coups. There's different countries are friends today and enemies tomorrow. What kind of an environment is that for business? Are business deals steadier? Are people more constant in commerce? Or is it as subject to treachery, to change, as we know the political world is?
I don't know whether I'm confident to even address that problem or not, but I have some thoughts on it, and that is that there's nothing, those people have been fighting for 4,000 years that we know about. I think that's about right.
Sounds good.
They're going to be fighting for 4,000 more. And the only way you can control what happens over there is go get it done yourself. You know, outside that, you're going to continue having these people in the different religions that they got. They're going to continue to fight till the end of time unless some power is brought in, like the United Nations or something, to stop the unnecessary deaths and killings that go on. I think it's there. And it's not going to change any time soon unless the United Nations does become an integral part of world politics.
When you were in Libya then, were you able to make long-term business deals, or did you always keep short time frames on them?
They didn't make a difference. They didn't make a difference to them. You sign a contract when worth the paper is written on. They'd change it for you the next morning, 9 o'clock. If you had a 10-year contract, it might not last 10 hours.
So it wasn't handshakes like in Texas?
Get them a check, bring them to Paris, give them a check. That's what did it. After they did what you wanted them to do. You never paid them in advance.
Did you have any bad experiences with that, paying them in advance?
No, I didn't have anything to do with that. That got done. No question about it. And that's as I say, we can't impose our morals on other countries. That's the way they live. That's in Mexico, right? Next door neighbor. Unfortunately, it's the same way down there. That's what's ruined the country financially, is that one fact.
One of the things that people talk about as our economy becomes part, as you said, more and more of a world economy is the need to do more and more of what some people are calling political risk assessment. I remember reading a book that Malcolm gave me about Libya, and that there had been Oxy and other companies had made a supposition in 1968 that King Idris would be in power for another 5 years, and then just a year later they had the coup bringing Gaddafi. And did you, when you went to the Middle East, did you worry about political stability as you looked? Or did you have anybody in your organization doing this? How did you do that then?
That was done with other people besides myself. I was in the operating end of that business. I knew some things that went on there, but I didn't, that happened that probably I might not have handled it like they did, but I didn't know all the ramifications of it. I know you couldn't trust them, but mine was a you know, to get the oil drilled, to get the pipe moving, to get the pipeline laid, to all those type of operating problems that come along that I was involved in. And the political side of it, I didn't handle at all.
Did you find when you handled the operating side of things, do you know, did Occidental Petroleum or any of the oil companies find the State Department, the consular officials dealing, you know, the commercial attaches, were they helpful to you in setting up business deals? Would they make contacts for you? Were they an obstacle? Would you not tell, I mean, I think when you would come to a country, wouldn't you have to at least inform the embassy that you were in town and state your business, or what was the kind?
I never did.
You just...
I just went and got the job done. But I never had that problem, really. I went and see him, of course, at time to time, but I never had any problems I took there.
Because I know one of the people that you worked with, Armand Hammer, used to drive the State Department crazy. Yeah. He would come in.
He wanted to run it.
And make business deals and the commerce. There were several stories in the press about how the U.S. State Department was unhappy that they weren't able to keep track of what he was doing. And it seemed almost from his point of view that these were two enemies, Armand Hammer and the State Department, fighting each other.
I don't know of any real advice that he ever took about that sort of thing. I mean, he probably came up in the world of paying people, and from the very beginning, and I think he just couldn't operate any other way. If you bought a deal to him that you could make on the ground and not pay off anybody, he didn't want a part of it. But if you bought when you had to pay off somebody, he figured that's a good deal. Strange.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that was right in terms of doing business? You need to...
No, it didn't. I never found that to be true. I found it to be true of politicians. And I don't mean being outside the law with them, but you know, you need to contribute to political campaigns if you've got issues that you really want them to listen to you about, and that's not on national, it's state too. They will certainly a contributor that contributes the maximum amount you can under the law they're more apt to sit down and let you go through your thoughts about education or about the environment or whatever. And so you do a lot of that. I do myself, I still do.
You had mentioned earlier that the oil business is a fraternity almost, and that you can, when you started in the business, everybody took care of each other, and you shook hands, and you found that you talked about today that the banking industry has reached a point where the ethics of business has declined to a point where you can't really count on them for money. Do you think there has really, we've talked about a precipitous moral decline in the world of government and politics. Watergate, Irangate, all those things in the public have made us talk about that. In your career in the business community in the United States, have you seen a real moral decline, or is that just something people talks about? I mean, but that doesn't really exist. From say the 50s to the 80s, have the way in which businessmen make money, invest their money, with Adam Smith talked about the public trust in some way. Is that really lost?
Well, I can only tell it from the perspective that I see it in.
Well, that would be valid.
And I told somebody last night, I believe that I've lived in the great days of our country. The bureaucrats never bothered me a whole lot. I get in a fuss with them, but usually got it worked out somewhere down the road. And the regulations that the bureaucrats have put in with incompetent people to carry them out have bothered me. But basically, I've lived in an era where it was pretty trustworthy. I mean, I choose to believe a man is honest until he proves different to me. And I think most people are honest. Their intentions are good. Sometimes events overwhelm them like it did in the oil business when they closed down the oil business in '80 or took away the price controls. Well, it just went right down the tube overnight. Well, those people worked hard all these years building up their companies, couldn't help that. That was an economic fact of life that they lost their money overnight because of political expediency. But I'm glad that I maybe since 1980, well, I haven't done as much as I did between 50 and 80.
Mm-hmm. So you think 1980 is a sort of a benchmark of change in the whole climate of American business. We think of 80s as the decade of greed,
right,
of the leveraged buyouts
right,
and things
right,
like. Do you think that's exaggerated? Do you think there still are?
No.
Is the 90s going to be a more honest decade in the world of business?
I don't know. I hope so, but I don't know. I really don't know because, you know, I used to think that a man's life was the most important thing to him, and I've changed my mind now. I think greed way overcomes the desire to survive. It's just really terrible to see people have greed. I think it's one of the worst things a person can have myself. And then greed for different things. I mean, money and power. And you see an awful lot of it. They really don't care about the economy. They don't care about the education. They don't care about anything if they can go make money on it. You know, it's just a real bad disease going through our country, I think.
Do you think there's a difference between political greed and abuse and business greed and abuse, or are these two sides of the same coin?
No, I don't think there's any difference. It's just as bad in one place as it is the other.
Same kind of person.
Yeah, same people.
I was wondering if you could comment on, as we look, I suppose, at the business history of the United States, the oil business seems to have produced more than its share of characters within the world of business. You know, there's the Gettys, there's H. Ross Perot, there's also this intriguing figure that's just passed from the scene of Armand Hammer. You'd mentioned earlier that this was a fraternity within the oil business. I think it's probably safe to say that Mr. Hammer was one person who never quite fit in. He came from the outside. He seemed to have his own agenda. His father was a member of the American Communist Party. He wasn't himself, and yet I guess he almost stands as one of the people that Lenin said, if you give the capitalist a rope, he'll go and hang himself. People thought that Mr. Hammer, in his business dealings with the Soviet Union, seemed to almost illustrate that, you know, in his life. What do you think about his role in the oil business? And then also, I guess, talking about him, but then also, what do you think about the opening up of the Soviet Union now? Do you think there is a real opportunity for American business to become part of that, what shall we say, the capitalization of the old communist world? Is this a great world of opportunity for us in the 90s?
I feel like it is, because, you know, for the first time in my lifetime that I've really ever thought about things like this, there may be an opportunity to have world peace for a while. Certainly maybe small wars and dictators and so forth, but then basically the big wars, I think maybe we got an opportunity to do that. And that's really the reason I think that I felt very strongly about what Bush did, is that maybe that was the beginning of an opportunity to prove to the world that it could be done through the United Nations, and that they would listen to reason when it came down to the destruction of countries. And I still feel that way. So I don't know. I reckon maybe I'm wrong about it, but I'm hoping that that's what comes out of the Persian Gulf thing, is a community of nations that don't go to war every 10 years or 20 years. And I've felt in recent years too that that we ought to help Russia. I went to Russia 4 or 5 years ago, and I thought, when I saw it just as a tourist, I didn't know anybody, anything. I just went on a train for 22 days through the country and stopped in the towns and spent the night and all that. But I felt like that they were going to have a resolution. I really felt like that was what was going to happen, because you could see that these people were deprived of some of the things we think about good necessities in life, and that they were going to get enough of it and they'd have a revolution. And it didn't happen that way. Gorbachev came along and is trying to bring them out of the communist world into the capitalistic world. But the people that are hungrier will fight. I mean, there's no question about that, and they should probably. And I'm hoping he don't get killed somewhere along here. I'm afraid that could happen real easily, and that his dream will come true. But in order to do that, you know, we should help him in every way in the world we could. It's better spending $1 billion in sending food than it is spending $1 billion on Star Wars. It might keep us from having another war. I mean, we should take all of our surplus food and just give it to them, because, you know, some of it's rotting in tugboats along barges along the Mississippi River. And that's not gaining us anything, but help him any way we could to convince the people that a democracy is a finer form in government than the Communist Party. I don't know whether we'll do it or not, but certainly the one commodity that if the geologists I've talked to that know a lot about this think there's just a world oil supply in Russia that hadn't been tapped, big reserves. And if we could help them to do that, well, they could pay back the help that we gave them in oil.
I mean, you're somebody who's dug 135 wells. Would you like to start looking in the Crimea, around Odessa, and
I don't know
Siberia?
I don't know enough about the area to have any feeling about that. I don't know where it is, but geologists say that there's great reserves there, and they're not taking care of their wells properly either. You can ruin a well by overproducing it, for an example. They've overproduced some of their properties, and the well's gone to water. But if you had, you know, a good American engineering and all involved in that, well, it might be one way that we could help them and get our money back by, you know, getting half the oil or a third of it or something to pay us in oil instead of dollars. If we went away and developed a reserves for them, it might be the almost the salvation of Russia as we'd like for it to be. What kind of shape would we have been in Russia if we'd gone into Iraq 3 or 4 years ago with Russia supporting them the way they did? We'd had a world war.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the greatest thing in the world happened is the fact that they have tried turned around in this interim period to give us an opportunity to go help the world economy. If Sadat had gotten control of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Kuwait, he would have controlled about 70% of the world oil. And we would have had a worldwide recession that would have brought on many wars.
Was this keeping the lines open to the Soviet Union, do you think, was this a motivation that kept Mr. Hammer constantly involved in a business sense with the Soviet Union?
Absolutely not. His was nothing in the world but old greed at work.
A factor of greed. So
right.
He wasn't in it to keep the lines open to the capitalist world. If you look at the people have talked about, and you talk about a world economy coming, and you've talked about a world peace that may come along with this world economy. As a businessman, as somebody, where do you see some dark clouds here to this world economy? Do you see some rising tensions, say, between ourselves and the Japanese, or what are the things that, when we think about this kind of centralization of one single world economy, of a possible world of peace, especially with the Cold War disappearing, for those of us who are looking for problems to study and analyze. Where do you think the problems lie in the next 10 years that make you worry about that dream a little bit?
I think the biggest problem is our own, and that's lack of education of our people to be able to meet these problems. Because we don't have the work ethic either in this country we used to have. And you know, if you're going to compete with the Japanese work 6 days a week, the Chinese work 7 days a week. And if you got a piece of equipment that somebody can run and you give it to the Japanese or give it to the Chinese, and we're working 5 days a week, what's going to be the price? I mean, where do you go from there? You lose the markets, what you do. I mean, that really is what bothers me, is a lack of our educational facilities for our coming generations in our public schools. I mean, we got to teach them how to be able to read instructions and carry out instructions. I'll give you a good example that I've seen in Japan. They have a gear factory there that manufactures gears for automobiles. I think that factory has been essentially duplicated by General Motors. That plant runs in Japan on about 300 people. In the United States, it takes 1,200 people to operate that same plant. It's just that simple. You're going to have to get competitive, you know, either by technology or by educating people to handle those type things, because the thing is run by robots, basically.
Yeah, now that raises one of the things we have just seen. You've made reference to President Bush and the Persian Gulf. We have just seen a war in which high tech basically proved its worth. People were worried about it and thinking that we were buying a pink elephant in the 1980s. Well, we've seen that taken all together with the training, with the tactics, and with the technology, that we've obviously reached a new plane here. We're not the only one that has this kind of high tech and this kind of high training. Do you think that we have, as we've shown militarily in the Persian Gulf, you mentioned robotics. We are, for example, way behind the Japanese in robotics.
Right.
As we look at a kind of a next generation world economy, do you think we can stand the pace of that? I mean, we proved this militarily. If we move into this high robotics, high electronics age, are we the cream of the cream here?
I don't feel confident to answer a question like that. I'm not, as I told you to begin with, I don't know a lot about one thing, but I know something about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And that's just one I don't think I know any answer to, because I don't know all the studies and all have been made that would appear that we got to meet that competition if we have free trade. And I'm not sure, you know, we should have free trade sometime, but
I'm wondering, yeah, that's what I'm wondering about when we think about free trade. We have industries we want to protect, you know. North Carolina, we've spent a lot of time worrying about the textile industry. We have a large number of workers. The Japanese had so much fewer workers. They've had an expansion, so they've gone into robotics. We haven't gone into robotics to the same extent because we do have a fairly large workforce, right, and we'd put them out of work. That seems to be an issue in our society now between free trade advocates and those who are worried, especially with ties to labor unions, worry about protection. Do you see us able to continue? That's been a great goal to push free trade. Is that something Americans can be comfortable about?
I tell you what they can't be comfortable about. If our politicians don't wake up, and I've dealt with the Japanese, and I think I know a little bit about how they think.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm for free trade both ways. If we ship peanuts, for an example, to Japan, I've sent peanuts to friends of mine with Mitsui and Nippon and all. they're kept in the warehouse for over 6 months in heat, and they're spoiled. And you ask why, and they say we want to see if the cardboard they were sending had any environmental impact on our country. Well, that's stupid. You know, they kept it there to keep from importing peanuts. It just made that much sense. He read recently where our rice growers had a little display of rice and they threatened to put them in jail. Well, you know, my answer to that is, in the morning at 7 o'clock, we're not going to unload any more cars, Japanese cars in the United States. We're through. When you open up your markets, we're ready. Don't tell us anymore that you got to protect your rice farmers. I think that our diplomats and our politicians have absolutely thrown away a golden opportunity to have free trade, but we do not have free trade. You read stories, and they're certainly true, about people going over there and trying to open a store or sell cigarettes over there. You know, you not only have a cartel of industries working against you, but you got a cartel of the government and industries and labor all working together, all got the same program, planned out 10 years ahead of time what they're going to do. And then they don't want to accept the things that we do best, and we accept the things that they do best. But it's not a two-way street. I think last month there was something like $5 billion trade deficit, and it's up to, I don't know what it is now, $300 or $400 billion over there that we're a deficit trade with Japan. I mean, what's happened to our politics? Sure, we want free trade, but you give us free trade and we'll give you free trade. That just is that simple. And they worry about, you know, how do you do this? That's the only job I know in government I'd like to have, is to be a trade representative, because I can get that changed in 24 hours. Just no problem at all.
If you were that trade representative, another area where you've had a great deal of experience with is the issue of OPEC. How would you deal with the OPEC cartel? Do you think, on balance, that the OPEC cartel has actually served some good purposes, or do you think that it's wreaked devastation on the international oil business and economy?
Well, I personally happen to believe that cartels are bad things for the public. I really do. And if OPEC had never gotten together and had that embargo, we probably would still have $4 or $5 crude oil, which our people could make money at because of the way the economy was, the price of pipe and the price of cement, the price of drilling and all those things. But when it got out of hand like it did in '73, and when they put the embargo on, you know, it absolutely left us vulnerable to the production of the Middle East. And we don't want to be in that shape. I mean, I can't tell you if they'll ever get OPEC back together again. I don't know. But they probably will sometime get it back together. Excuse me, my eyes tear a lot.
Yeah.
And so I really don't know. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody try to analyze that question either. I really don't.
Do you feel, I know energy is something you've dealt with a great deal, and we've talked about oil and oil cartels. And we need oil and we need energy to fuel our industrial civilization. Do you think there is enough oil to continue, or natural gas to continue the type of industrial system that we have? Do you think we need to transfer to nuclear power in a massive way? Are you impressed with things like fusion and the possibility of that kind of energy? Or I know several oil companies got quite heavily involved with oil shale in Colorado, and that all busted. Do you think that's a path that we need to reopen?
Absolutely. No question about that. I think there'll be other sources of energy that maybe you and I have never even dreamed of at this point. But I think we made a terrible mistake in nuclear energy, for an example. I think the federal government should have bought up every one of those plants and finished them. but because it's pretty well proven, like France, I think now gets like 80% of all their energy from one group of atomic plants there in some valley not far from Paris. And of course that took them off relying on the Middle East like they were doing at the time. And it would certainly prolong our supply of oil if they went ahead and finished them. And then the end results, the public would be served well because the price of energy would stay lower. I could easily see crude oil be $40 or $50 a barrel in 7 or 8 years from now, because if they get this deal in the Middle East settled, they will get back together again and won't cheat like they were doing at one time.
Part of peace in the Middle East then will be the reviving of the oil cartel,
Right.
and high-priced oil. People thought we were fighting in the Persian Gulf for cheaper oil, so that's an interesting.
I think we were fighting for access. The prices when you need it doesn't make a real lot of difference. In fact, I really think that Bush made a real mistake. I don't say he made a mistake, that's the wrong words. I think he didn't inform the American people the real reason that we were in Iraq and Kuwait, and that was to protect the world oil supply. If they got in control of it, well, oil would have been probably $40 or $50 a barrel, and our industrial world would have had the greatest recession in history. It would have been terrible. And it would have been worldwide. It wouldn't be one or two companies. All those countries that couldn't supply their own supply would just have a terrible time, that's all.
Do you think we ought to continue to build up the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as a stopgap measure? Do you think it's adequate right now?
It's probably adequate, because if you can't solve it in 90 days, it's probably going to be prolonged and wouldn't make a difference anyway. I can't answer that question, really. I'm not a professional at all about it, but that's the truth. If it don't last 90 days, well, you know, we got problems anyway if we're in an emergency situation.
Okay, well, I think if there's anything else you'd like to add or comment, I think we've gone through the types of things we want. We'd like to thank you very much for agreeing to be here with the Living History program. And thank you for being with us this afternoon then, Mr. Davis.
I've enjoyed it. I really have.